Thank you very much, Isabella, and thank you for having us at this IslandoraCon. The documentation interest groups, one of the interest groups that has been around for quite a long time. It went on hiatus for a bit and then was reconvened. So it's taken on many shapes and forms over the past years. We would like to today give an introduction to what the documentation interest group is, what our goals and our modes of operation are, and also we want to invite everybody who's interested to join our regular meetings and to join the work to make Islandora documentation better. Part of this presentation today is also to provide you with the necessary tools that are required to contribute to the documentation. There are multiple ways for multiple levels of expertise or kind of different levels of comfort with technical documentation that you can. So there is options for anyone. We have this on our agenda for today. We, as I mentioned, want to give a brief introduction about the DIG's objectives and goals. We do want to give a brief walk or highlight some points of the existing Islandora documentation. Yamil is going to present on some of the GitHub essentials that are necessary for working with the Islandora documentation. We do want to show you how, if you feel adventurous, you can make quick edits to the documentation pages yourself. I'm going to introduce very rough basics of Markdown, which is used to write the documentation pages. And then we're going to go over some do's and don'ts for documentation that we have assembled over the past years on how to create good documentation pages. An important aspect is how to reach developers on Slack. Not everybody who is writing documentation is actually a developer, so it's very important that you keep in close communication with the developers if you are trying to document aspects of the Islandora stack. And if we have time at the end, we do want to make some space or time available for Q&A and possibly even a live demo. So the DIG documentation interest group's purpose. Documentation interest group is one of the interest groups that are sponsored by the Islandora Coordinating Committee, which is one of the governance groups of the Islandora Foundation. The DIG's purpose has been for a long time to coordinate the creation and maintenance of documentation by the Islandora community. So the important things to notice is that this is a community-driven effort. And that the DIG is coordinating the creation and the maintenance of that effort. The goals of the DIG, as listed in our terms of reference, are to establish best practices for Islandora documentation, to establish collaborative workflows for creating and maintaining documentation, to review and discuss documentation-related issues or actual issues on particular pages of the documentation, and to identify and prioritize documentation gaps and issues based on community feedback. What you do not see, or what you did not see in the list of goals or in the purpose, is that the DIG, as it currently stands or as it currently is shaped, that the DIG is actually writing all of the documentation. That is unfortunately unfeasible with the amount of or the size of the group and the amount of involvement that we currently see. What we do is that we collaboratively steward the existing documentation in a GitHub repository, which hosts the source code for the documentation pages that are then turned into, so this is the source code of the documentation, and we will go over this in a bit again in more depth. And the source code of this documentation is then, through an automatic process, turned into these nicely rendered HTML pages with the actual documentation content. The DIG stewards or maintains the repository and the technology in a way. We do host monthly meetings where we discuss issues that are sent our way and open pull requests. So suggestions from contributors to edit or update or add to the documentation. Those are discussed in those monthly meetings. We did in the past, and we plan to do that in the future again, organize and support documentation sprints. So dedicated amounts of time where people focus on writing, updating documentation and filling gaps, if any. If you are interested in participating in that effort, we invite you to join our meetings every second Wednesday of the month at 2 p.m. Eastern. We've put a link to the DIG's agenda documents. There's a separate repository for those in the slides, and the slides are available in the shared folder for IslandoraCon, but you can always reach out to us and we'll provide you with the necessary credentials or the link. And if you want to join those monthly meetings every second Wednesday of the month, there is a Zoom link in the agenda document. You can participate in future documentation sprints. You can at any time contribute issues or documentation page improvements. You can contribute new documentation or cookbook recipes. And if you're really into documentation, there is also a leadership opportunity. The DIG has had 3 co-chairs for a long time, and we unfortunately lost one, or like one of the stairs had to step down. One of the chairs had to step down most recently, so there is a possibility to step into that role as well. If you want to get in touch, I mentioned our monthly meetings every second Wednesday of the month. You can reach out to Yamil and myself via the emails that will be in the slides. A good way to reach out is to contact us on the Islandora Slack space. There is a dedicated documentation Slack channel. You can reach out via the community mailing list, or you can submit tickets for issues and pull requests on GitHub via the GitHub repository URL that's provided here. With that, I just want to give or present a few highlights of the current Islandora documentation. As I mentioned, this is the product of an automated process that turns the source code of the documentation into this web page, which has a nice navigation. The documentation is segmented into different pages, and every page in the documentation in turn has a table of contents. The documentation is currently broken up into sections that deal with the fundamental concepts of Islandora, what it is, how it does digital asset management, for instance, also in comparison to previous versions of Islandora. There is a pretty sizable section on the installation of Islandora. There are a couple of cookbook recipe style walkthroughs or tutorial style walkthroughs. There is also already a sizable library of video documentation that has been created for instance, by Melissa Anes, the previous community manager of the Islandora Foundation, and more recently also by Rosie Lefebvre. If you are interested in contributing to Islandora as a developer or as somebody who documents, there are pages on how to edit documentation, and I will go into that in a moment and briefly demonstrate how the first steps. If you are technically a little more savvy, there is documentation on how to build the documentation the same way that it is built on GitHub. You can build the documentation locally on your own computer in order to write documentation and test it, how it'll look in real time. But again, that is perhaps a little more advanced, and you can or you cannot, may or may not be interested in this process. After this short tour of the existing documentation structure, I'm going to hand it over to Yamil for some GitHub essentials that are required or that are recommended for contributing to the documentation efforts.
Thank you, Mirko. So I'm going to review some ways you can use GitHub to help out with documentation. But first, let me start. I just want to repeat what Mirko mentioned earlier, that there's two ways you can look at the documentation. We have what's called the Git repository view or the source code. It has a domain of github.com, and we have the rendered HTML version, which ends with github.io. So this is what the repository version looks like, and that's the URL. This is a public version, the one for people to digest. And I want to mention there's a quick way to go from one version to the other. So if you're in the repository version, if you scroll down that first page, you can see this link that says read the documentation online. That'll take you to the HTML version. And if you happen to be stuck in the HTML version and you want to go to the GitHub version, in the upper right, you'll see this link that I highlighted called GitHub. That'll take you back. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. Now, there's many ways to help us out, but some of the ways will require a GitHub account. So I have a longer presentation that I mentioned here about how to set up a GitHub account, but now I'll do a short version of that presentation. The first step is to go to github.com, and in their site, they usually have one or two buttons that say sign up. Click on one of those buttons, and you'll be asked around 10 questions. About 3 of them are required. Some of the required ones are providing a valid email address. You need to provide a valid password according to their rules. You have to come up with a username that's unique and not used by any one of the existing 83 million current GitHub users. So it might take you a couple of tries to get something unique. And GitHub asks you to pick a spiral galaxy to prove you're not a robot. So watch out for that. Now that you have a GitHub account, one of the things you can do with that account is to report issues. But let's talk about issues, because issues is a catch-all term from GitHub for a mechanism to provide feedback to a repository. Typically, issues are used for bug reports and they're used for feature requests. But for us, we can use issues to report some issue with the documentation or to report that there's some missing documentation. So you can imagine if we go to the repository version of the Islandora documentation, this page looks like that. And in the upper left, there's a link for issues, which takes you to the issues queue or a page with a list of the issues. And before you put in a new issue, if that was your goal, I always suggest that you do a quick search in the bar in the middle, the search bar. Before you put an issue, put in a few terms that match your issue, because I want to avoid creating duplicate issues. So in this case, I searched for puppies and I got no hits. So that means I'm free to add my brand new issue by going to that button on the right that says new issue. Now, after you hit that button, you'll be given a choice of these issue templates that we've created. And there's one for bug reports and other situations. But in this case, we're going to use a documentation template. So click on Get Started on the right. And here's where a new issue edit view looks like. The two main regions of issue are the title and the lower part, which is called the comments. In the title field, you see that the issue template has already added a prefix that says docs. Leave that prefix there, and to the right of it, add a few words that summarize the issue you're adding. It might be feature XYZ is not mentioned in section ABC. That might be a very simplistic way to write a title. And then in the bottom section, note that there's questions from the issue template that are already in there, and try to answer those questions. It'll be questions like, is this an issue related to documentation that already exists? Or is this an issue related to documentation that does not exist yet? And after you do your writing, and it's going to be using Markdown, which Mirko is going to talk about later, you can click what's called the preview button, which is next to right, to see what the Markdown is going to look like. This is what the issue will look like to others. So again, when you're done answering the template questions, you can click the button on the lower section called Submit New Issue. Now I'll transfer back to Mirko to explain one of the ways that we can edit documentation.
Oops, to find the unmute button. If indeed you're adventurous and want to directly make an edit to a documentation page, you've come across a typo or something that is factually wrong or is outdated because the software has evolved, there is a very quick way, if you have the prerequisites out of the way, to actually edit documentation or start the editing process right from the Islandora Documentation webpage. So assuming that you have created a GitHub account, you can click the pencil icon in the top right corner of the screen, and you will end in a editor that'll show you the source text for that documentation page, and this will allow you to make edits. If you are satisfied with the edits that you've made, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about Markdown, the syntax or the markup language that is used to write the actual documentation pages. If you're satisfied with your edits, you can scroll down to the bottom of the page, and if you are not already a member of the Islandora organization on GitHub, you will see a button that allows you to propose a change. What you can also do is to preview your edits before submitting them. This preview function isn't perfect, but it'll give you a good impression of what your edited text will look like once you submit it and once it's then rendered as an actual web page. And as I said, the button at the bottom of the page might, in your case, say propose changes, in which case you will create a pull request that will then end up in the pull request queue for the documentation, and the documentation interest group members can review it and approve it, and then your change will become part of the documentation. I mentioned, or both Yamil and I mentioned Markdown quite a couple of times. Markdown is essentially a shorthand notation for writing structured documents, web documents. It is a system that can take text that is marked up in a special way and turn that into HTML pages that look nice, but Markdown is a lot easier or shorter, faster to write than actual HTML. We've put a link to the original specifications for that syntax or markup language syntax in the slide. There are hundreds of, if not thousands, millions of tutorials on Markdown that go into greater depth than I can do it here, available on the web. So I'll really just want to show some few basics in order to explain the principles of Markdown. One of those principles of Markdown is that it allows you to structure a web page that you want to create by giving the page a title or a header, and assign further headers to the different sections of your page. The way we're using this for our documentation, as you can see on this slide, every documentation page will need a page title, which will render, or which will be shown at the very top of the page. And the way we mark that up in the documentation page source code is by writing one hash or pound sign, a space sign, and then the page title, and that will turn into this headline that is the page title. The page title is then also used for the navigation. Any further sections that you want to divide your page up into, you should use second level headers or third level headers for main and subsections. Sectioning content makes it more readable, but I also want to warn against creating too many levels that might make the page more difficult to read at some point. The way you create a second level header is by using 2 pound signs or 2 hash signs, space, and then the title of your section. And the third level works equivalently. Third level headers you just create by using 3 hash signs. Nice thing about the system that we're using for creating HTML pages from Markdown is that it will also automatically create a table of contents. As you can see in this example, the different levels or header levels will show up here, and they will get indented based depending on the actual level of header level that you're using. Another important tool that we're using for documenting, whether it's used for any kind of technical documentation, is emphasis. We recommend to apply strong emphasis, which is in HTML rendered as bold text by either using 2 stars or 2 underscores immediately before and immediately after the text that you want to emphasize in Markdown, and that is then on the HTML page rendered as bold print. If you want to emphasize something using italic text, which is less salient or doesn't stand out as much from the rest of the text, you can do that as well. It's a less strong emphasis, and you can use that by using 1 star immediately preceding and immediately following the text that you want to highlight, or 1 underscore sign immediately preceding and immediately following the text that you want to highlight. You can create lists, which also improve the readability of can improve the readability of your documentation quite a lot. Markdown has very handy mechanisms for creating unordered lists. You start a line with a dash, a space, followed by the list items text, and then the next line you then again use a dash, space, and the list items text, and so on, in order to create a list. It's important to use the space character because that is how Markdown recognizes that you're actually trying to create a list. And especially if you want to nest unordered lists, you have to use 4 space characters at the beginning of the line for the next lower, or for an indented or nested list under a list item that starts where the line immediately starts with a dash. So in nesting, you start a list item, and the nested list item underneath that starts with 4 space characters, dash, space character, and then the text of your list items. Another very nice tool is creating ordered lists, especially if you have a sequence of steps in your documentation. You might consider giving it an explicit numbering, and the way you can do this is by simply writing a number, a dot, space, and then the text of the list item. And this doesn't have to be, you don't have, in Markdown, you don't have to write the actual numbers that you want to appear on the page. Instead, you could, in principle, just write 1 dot space list item, 1 dot space another list item, 1 dot space another list item, and Markdown or the Markdown processor will automatically count for you and will turn that into a counted list. For ordered lists, nesting is possible as well, and it works the same way as for unordered lists. You start your nested list by 4 space characters, and you will get a nicely indented list. Finally, since we're talking about HTML or hypertext, links are important. You want to link as much as possible, either internally to other parts of the web pages, the documentation pages, or to external resources that are helpful. And the way you create external links is by putting the link text that you want to appear as the clickable text on the web page in square brackets, immediately followed by parentheses or round brackets that contain the actual link URL. This is basically it. And if you know, or if you've seen HTML, HTML makes this a lot more complicated or difficult to write. So this is a nice shorthand for creating or inserting links into your documentation. One thing to note, if you want to create an internal link to other documentation pages within the Islandora documentation, you need to find out the relative path of the source code document, so the Markdown document, in the GitHub repository if you want to link to that. And that is something that we will go into in a moment, how to navigate the GitHub repository. So this is perhaps the only kind of quirk that you have to work around. You need to understand how the source code documents are laid out in the GitHub repository in order to put in links to another document than the one that you're currently editing. So again, this was really very, very basic, a very, very basic introduction. Markdown has shorthand or short code for inserting images as well. You can mark up code, especially if you want to highlight code snippets or commands, command line commands in your documentation. There are very nice and easy ways to do this. You can create tables, which are again a very, very important tool in technical documentation. And you can create admonitions or callouts, which will render as like nice, colorful little boxes that highlight a particular piece of text, like a warning or a note to the reader of the documentation. With that, I'll hand it over back to Yamil for some do's and don'ts.
Thank you very much. Let me start the slideshow again. Now, Mirko just went over the syntax for Markdown. Now I want to talk about style. And I want to start by showing how we have a style guide page on the documentation repository and the HTML version. I check it often. I recommend that you visit it before you write documentation and you want some guideline. So I'm going to summarize some do's and don'ts from that page. The first one is pretty straightforward. If you're writing documentation that references something that the user will interact with, like a button, and you're writing out that button name, use the bold style in Markdown for that button name, which in this case will be 2 asterisks. If you're just referencing a UI element that we're not going to interact with, but just the title of a section, the title of a window, then use the italics Markdown style. So that's 2 simple examples of things that we have in our style guide. Now, something else I always recommend is that you need your own system to try out writing documentation. And if you don't have a local Islandora 2 system, you can use a community sandbox at this URL. And now we have the ISLE way of installing Islandora. So the ISLE demo is a lot simpler than how to install Islandora 7. So you may be able to build a local version if you want to do more experiments. So that's another recommendation we have for writing documentation. Now, 2 simple don'ts for our style guide is watch out for having what are called trailing spaces in your documentation. A simple example is if you wrote a short paragraph, make sure that to the right of the very last period of your paragraph, there's no spaces to the right of it. I used to do that by mistake, so it's very helpful to trim those extra spaces, and for the last sentence, just have it stop at the period. Turns out that those trailing spaces make it hard for someone to study the history of that particular documentation file you've created. So when we want to analyze the history and future changes, those trailing spaces can make it much harder for both documentation and when you write code. The other simple don't we always mention is try to avoid what are called curly quotes and curly apostrophes. Try to use the straight quotes in the font that you use, because sometimes the curly quotes will break the rendering of the HTML. Now, one thing that happens often is that when you're writing documentation, you may not be sure what section of the documentation it should live or how this new feature works, so we have to reach out to developers. And since the Islandora developers mailing list is in read mode only at this point, you will find the developers hanging out in the Islandora Slack workspace. But one thing that's a little bit different with Slack, if you've never visited, you first have to start using this invite URL. And here's a bit.ly version of that link, and we'll post it. That link can be found later on if you go to the Islandora CA website and go to the Contact Us page or the Community page. Scroll down and you'll see this Channels of Communication section. And if you click on Read More, you'll get the invite link. You see, this invitation process will require a valid email address and some valid password, but it'll give you finally access to the Slack workspace. And to this process, you end up with a free Slack account. And I commend you, please try to remember what email address you use so you can access it later. And once you've done the invitation process, the URL for our Slack is very simple. Just point your browser to islandora.slack.com and you'll be able to use Slack right on your browser. Now, when you are in Slack, this is basically what it looks like for a new user. I want to first point out on the left-hand side, you'll see what are called the channels, almost like a chat room. And there's 2 channels by default when you're a new user. You have general and support. And when you want to ask questions about how to use a particular feature and want to reach a developer, I suggest you use the support channel. Click on support and start writing a message to see if it can get help on your documentation related questions. And of course, remember, those people helping you there are volunteers and the working hours may be different than yours. So please be patient in how long it takes for you to get help. Now, there's a documentation channel that me and Mirko hang out at. And to find those additional channels that are not shown by default, you go to the upper right, the upper left, where I highlighted here. There's a button called All Channels. Sometimes it's hidden on the More button a little bit below. And last time I checked, there was 34 channels, and I believe the last channel that was created was for this conference. But what I'd rather you do is, when you're in this view, search for documentation, and the 32 results will be filtered down to 5, and go to the row for documentation. And when you mouse over, you'll get a chance to either view or join that channel. And the difference between those two, if you join, I believe the channel will be permanently added to your sidebar of list of channels. Now, we've showed you how to do Markdown and all this technical stuff. It might be overwhelming. Me and Mirko, we just want more documentation. So if you just have some basic questions on Markdown, syntax help, just reach out to me by email, reach out to us in the documentation channel, which we use for announcements, and we talk about issues. And worst case, just share a Google Doc with me, and maybe we can work together, because I just want to add more documentation.